Good afternoon and welcome back. In this lecture, now that we have the basic understanding of the assets that we'll be using, we know what some of the terminologies are, and we've seen some of the concepts behind where they've been created. What I want to do to wrap up the assets section, I'm going to make sure that we have all of our content ready for use in the game. So to do this, if we go to the art folder, the first thing that we want to address is the models down here. So under art and models, we have all of our models, which are currently still grey. So we can address this straight away now. So I've mentioned it a few times in the previous lectures that we have something called a material. We currently have these two, which we won't be using too much yet, but we want to make 3 of our own materials. So we will cover the creation of materials in this lecture, and then moving on from here, we will start applying things to the models themselves. So to begin with, whilst you're in the materials folder, if we right click, and we will create a new material. And the way that I tend to name things in Unreal is, for materials, I'll start with a lowercase m for material, and then I'll then name it what it is and what it's doing. So we'll make, first of all, the material for the player ship. But the only thing is that the way that I've set this up, this doesn't just control the player ship, this also controls any objects that share the colour with the player. So for simplicity, I'm just going to call this M player. So we now have our first material in the game that we've made, at least. So if we double click this to open it, we can drag this tab, which is currently it just hangs around in the middle of the screen. If we drag the light grey tab, we can drag this into the bar at the top of the screen. And we now have our material editor. At the moment, we have a standard black Phong shader. It's got a small amount of reflection in the shader. It's black because we haven't given it a colour. So the first thing I like to do is, I'm not a huge fan of this glossy sheen that always comes in games nowadays. So what I will do is I'm going to create a constant. So right click anywhere and type the word constant, and then just select that. And all this is a single float value, and we can apply this to different aspects of our material. So with this node selected, we can get the value in the left hand side of the screen, and we'll just give this a value of 1. And then from here, this is how we connect things in the Unreal blueprints and the Unreal editors. So we have this node here that we're just going to drag a wire from, and we will put this in the roughness. So we can now see the example that we're getting over here has changed. It's now completely flat. It's a smooth shaded material. And we can just drag this around and make that a bit tidier. So that was nice and simple. Very easy introduction to materials so far. But now the next thing that we have is a grey material, or a black material. So we can address this next. So we want to look at our base colour just here. So a colour is obviously made of red, green and blue, and those 3 values can be represented by something called a vector. So again, if we right click and type vector space 3, and we'll get a constant vector 3. And then if we plug this into the base colour and then double click on the vector that we've just created, we'll get this window open up. And let's just quickly test with a green. And remember what I mentioned when we were colouring the folder, is that if you want the example that you get over here to be the same as you see over here, you need to press the sRGB preview. And we're just going to drag this up so we get slightly lighter green. And then once you've got the colour that you're happy with, if you press OK, we can now see that our material has gone a yellowish green. So that was all we needed to do to change the colour. And I'm not going to leave it as this, but just so we can see how this works. If we press apply and save to make sure the changes have been stored, we can now see we have a yellowish green colour down here. And finally, if we go back to the models, and we'll find the player model. So the way that I've done the models in this, the player is actually the enemy 2 ship. And the reason for that is, as I've mentioned in the last lecture, when we try to keep things like the draw calls down, the less different types of models we have in the game, the more things it can draw from what's been committed to the memory. So it also allows us to see how we can use the same models in games and get away with using them over and over but making them look different. And there's also a game concept I want to go into behind this, but again, that's going to be more for future lectures when we get to some of the game theory on how we can add that into our prototype. But for now, just know that player is the enemy ship do. So if we double click that, it will open the model viewer, and we just need to use the mouse wheel to scroll out, and we press Alt and left click to pan around the object. The left click by itself will allow you to move around, and again the right mouse click will let you look around. So what we have here is a grey model. It's grey because we haven't given it a material, because we didn't import the materials with it, otherwise it would have had one assigned. But as I mentioned, that does mean that each of these would have created a unique material. So remember, I've said we're going to be using 3 materials for the whole game, whereas if we had allowed these to have a material each, we already have 11 different models, so we would have already had at least 11 unique materials. So again, we can start seeing how we're keeping the overhead of the project down, which is quite nice. But to give this a material, if we go back into the model viewer and then look to the right panel, we have our material here. The world grid material is the default one it'll give it if it doesn't have a material generated. So if we select on that, you get a drop down, and we now have our M player material. If we select that, it will apply it, and this is what the material looks like. So it's just one solid yellow colour. And I wanted to show that because then this will emphasize how important the textures are and what the texture is doing. So if we head back over to our M player, now to remove a node, we don't want the color anymore because the color is going to be coming from the texture, like I've mentioned in the past. So what we can do is we hold the Alt button and click on the node to remove the link that that one had. Alternatively, because we don't need it at all, we can just select it and delete. And then what we do want, what we do want to plug into here is something called a texture sample. So if we type in texture sample, it's the sprite texture sample. It should be fine. That's what we need. And what we'll be doing is if we select this and then go to the left, we can see the material expression texture base, which is the thing we're interested in. We select that, and we want to select our player texture. And with that done, we can now see that's been applied to the source texture, and we just want to drag that down, and we can see that now maps the material with our texture. And we can change the view here as well if it helps. We can change this to be different objects to see how it would map around different things. So we've got cylinders, planes, cubes, and a teapot. Good old standard teapot, or in this case, the model. So it's really expecting the model of the ship. Okay, so with that change, make sure we apply and save. It won't take as long because we've only changed one thing this time. And then if we go back over to our enemy ship, we can see it now has already taken effect. So this now has the color that we wanted the player ship to have. And the reason it's done that is using the same material, but it now has the texture applied. And if we open up the UVs here, if you remember, although there's no texture showing here, this is where the UVs were in Blender, and this is where the boxes for the texture would have been, and it's still applying those, and it's now mapping that to the material, which is going on to the model, which is why we have the ship looking the way it does. So that is how we start making our materials. So the next thing I'll do is I'm going to press Ctrl W while selecting the M player, and I'm going to make one called M enemy, because this will be the material for all of the enemy object. And all we need to do is if we open that up by double clicking in the same way, we can go in here, select on the source texture, everything else can stay the same, and we just want to select our enemy texture. And then if we apply and save that to the new material, we now have our second game material. And then I'm going to do that one more time, so select either of those, press Ctrl W and call it M game. So this will be the material for absolutely everything else in the game. We're going to double click into that, select the texture, drop this down and select the game texture. We can see that one doesn't actually work on the ships, so we'll ignore that because the reason being is this isn't a 128 by 128 texture with just the 4 grids. This has been split into smaller divisions because I wanted to get more colours for all of the background assets and everything that's being used for this texture. So again, apply and save that, or just hit save and that actually does the apply for you. And what we'll do finally is if we just go through each of the models by double clicking them and opening them. So the boss will need to have the enemy texture or the enemy material. The coin, if we go into the coin, will need to have the game material, although the game assets will work with the player material as well, or the enemy material, but they're exactly the same. But yeah, they're intended to have the game material, so we've got the nice golden coin. And then if we open NM1, which is the first enemy, that will have the enemy material. And you can see basically what we're doing is we're going through all of the models and giving them their materials now so that it looks, so that they have a default material when we start using them rather than this grey texture. So in the island, again we can zoom out and see the island. We will have our game material again, and the power up, it doesn't matter what we give this, probably the enemy material will be fine, either the enemy or the player material. The projectile again doesn't matter as long as it has a colour, so we'll give that the enemy material as well. The trees, so all of the trees will need to have the game material, and each of these trees have been UV mapped differently so that they take a different colour. So we have a few different coloured trees. Oh, press player, need game, there we go. So I'm just doing this fairly quickly now because I think we've got the hang of how to do this, but it's going to be nicer to have some representation down here of what's going on. So then with all of that done, if we just press Ctrl S in here, that will save all of them to memory. So now whenever we drag something in, we will have a colour on that. Obviously we don't have a light, so we can't see yet, but we will address that later. So all of our assets now have a material and the texture. And hopefully it's starting to make a bit more sense what I mean by the fact we have 3 materials, and that's controlling the whole game, and it adds a nice level of variety at the moment, even though we only have those 3 different textures and the 3 different materials. So I'll leave that there for now, and I will see you in the next lecture.